My name is Sumati Ramaswamy, and I'm the chair of the History Department. And I'm delighted to welcome you all to this very special event. My job is basically to say hello, to welcome you to the classroom building, about which we're going to hear quite a bit more, and to thank Robin Kirk of the Duke Human Rights Center for bringing this event to us, and we are collaborating on this. And a very important, I think, moment for us to hear about our building, but also the deeper history of it and so on. And I look forward to the talk, but my job is now to say hello and introduce my very dear colleague, Professor Nancy McLean, who's the William Chafe Distinguished Professor of History, who is going to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Sumati, and good afternoon to everyone, and welcome. It's so good to see you here. We are delighted that you are here, and I'm really pleased to be able to be part of the program. I thought I'd start by stating the obvious, which is that at this fraught moment in our history, we can easily feel dispirited. Disinformation is rife in our public life. Democracy is under attack in our state and in the nation's capital, and cruelty is being normalized and turned into sport. Many rightfully fear where all this is heading, and yet I think that fear and anxiety, if we take a step back, we can realize that fear and anxiety can also cause us to miss encouraging developments that are also happening in this period, and that actually bode well for a better future. And one of them is the willingness of so many Americans and so many institutions of higher education, often prodded by their own students, to finally begin to reckon in a serious way with the deep and scarring history of racial injustice in this country and at so many of our colleges and universities. Today's talk is actually part of this ongoing reckoning at Duke. Professor Adam Domby's work, in fact, is an example of how archival research can have real-world effects, and I'm delighted that some of my students are here who are doing archival research, because who knows, they may end up with findings as significant as Professor Domby's. The findings that he will be sharing with us are, in fact, what led the History Department in May of 2018 to propose to the Duke Board of Trustees that the name of this building be changed. Why? So that it no longer honors a donor whose views and whose conduct and whose other so-called philanthropy did so much damage to so many, with consequences that still reverberate in our culture and our public policy, to the detriment of us all, but especially African Americans. In making that recommendation, the department was in fact following the lead of our local community in Durham. The Durham Public Schools Board of Education in 2017 removed Julian Carr's name from one of its schools. Having learned of this history from Professor Domby's important research, we concluded that we had to emulate that good example. As Duke's Board of Trustees unanimously concurred with the judgment of the department that Carr's legacy is antithetical to the values that our university should uphold, values of scholarly integrity, of inclusivity, of appreciation for all that we all gain from diversity, and of respect for the dignity of every person. As President Price said in his announcement of the decision, and I quote, "The renaming of the Carr building is a reflection of how our world has changed and a demonstration that our values and bonds endure far longer than mortar and stone." We are therefore so grateful to Adam Domby for coming to share his research with us, research that he did as he was working on his doctorate down the street at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. Professor Domby is now assistant professor of history at the College of Charleston, where he teaches courses on the Civil War and Reconstruction, and also serves as associate director of its Pearlstein-Lipov Center for Southern Jewish Culture. You can learn more about what he's going to present today from his book, which is quite literally hot off the press and will be for sale in the back of the room after his talk. And I am sure that he would be happy to sign books for those interested in signed books. So without further ado, please welcome Professor Adam Domby.
Thank you very much. The mic is just on me, right? Thank you so much. Thank you guys for the lovely introduction. Thank you all for attending. It's a great crowd. I have some old friends in the room. I have professors that I worked with when I was in grad school. I have my childhood babysitter in the room who has come out. I don't think I've seen you in 20 years. 20 years. But I would not be here if it were not for her helping me get through childhood. So I think she deserves a round of applause. I'm going to put her on the thing because during a very rough time in my life, my mother had cancer when I was a young child. She helped take care of me during that period when my mom was in the hospital. So I owe a lot to her. So I'm really glad you're here. So thank you all for having me. I think it's really appropriate we be talking in the what was once the Carr building. And hopefully I'm going to try to leave time for questions at the end so that I can make sure to answer the questions you guys have. Those of you who are grad students, this is a great example of how your research can matter when you don't expect it to. I first found, so does everyone know the Julian Carr speech that's so famous? Now show of hands, who knows the Julian Carr speech? Anyone not know the Julian Carr speech? All right, real quick, I'll give you a quick rundown on the Julian Carr speech. Back in 2009, when I was a first-year grad student, and I was a very young first-year grad student doing a paper, it was my first semester. I thought, I'll go see what's in the archives. Maybe they have the speech that was given at the dedication of Silent Sam, and I can write about that. And I thought, this will be interesting. And then I found it. And it included the quote that had been largely overlooked by anyone who looked at the campus of UNC. There had been a few scholars who noticed it and seen it as an example of violence during the Reconstruction era. But no one had sort of thought about how does this connect to the commemorative landscape. In it, Julian Carr says, and I want to apologize in advance for my language because I'm quoting now, that the monument was a monument to white supremacy, that he was proud of his part he played in that, and to quote him, not 100 yards from where we stand, I horsewhipped a Negro wench because she had spoken back to a white woman, essentially. She had publicly maligned, is I think the exact quote that he used. And it's a very graphic description of how he was proud of committing racial violence right after Appomattox, right? So this would have been, we think in 1865, although there's some evidence the attack may have actually happened a few years later that we're still trying to figure out. There is still some things. We're still trying to find her name. That's one of the things that my dream document, I always tell people when they ask, what's the dream document you could find? I'd be like, the complaint she filed with the Freedmen's Bureau. That would be my dream document, because it would tell me her name, and I'd love to have her name, and I don't. But when I did my index, I made sure that she had her own slot in the index. I couldn't put her name, but I made sure it wasn't under Carr. It's cross-referenced under Carr, but I thought it important that she have her own entry. But that monument, that speech at the time, I thought, this is a great way to teach history. Totally unaware of sort of what ramifications it would have. A few years later, the controversy over Silent Sam down the street, the Confederate Monument, burst into the scene once again, as it had done back and forth every couple years, really since the 60s. This had been going on, that there had been complaints, and really actually since it had been put up, people had been opposed to it. To be clear, African Americans in the community had not been a fan of it when it went up. It's pretty clear. But there had been calls to remove it that we can actually find record of going back all the way back into the 60s, maybe even into the 50s. But so I put out a little letter to the editor, to the Daily Tar Heel, and they wrote back and said, you got to shorten it. And I shortened it. So it was basically like, hey, here's what Julian Carr said. And I thought, maybe somebody will learn about Jim Crow. That was sort of my dream. And activists took it and ran with it. And they did a better job educating than the historians did. They did the educating factor. I did not. Let me be clear. The activists took off. They started showing it. They stood out there in front of the monument and talked to people on game day. They wrote letters to the editor. They wrote op-eds. They talked to reporters. And they really started moving public opinion. And by 2017, in light of both their work and what had occurred in 2015 in Charleston with the terrorist attack, the election of Donald Trump in 2016, and then the 2017 terrorist attack in Charlottesville, you had basically departments publicly coming out saying the monument should be removed. And that was sort of a fundamental shift you see in public opinion so it had once been sort of a small group of students, and of course African-American students had not liked this monument for a long time, but it began to expand sort of the sort of number of people in town who understood this, so that it became a hot button issue in the public discourse in a way that it hadn't, and ultimately was pulled down in 2018. So I never expected that to happen. I never meant to write this book. It's not my dissertation. My dissertation is entirely different. I did do the research while I was doing my dissertation, but it is not my dissertation topic. I put my dissertation aside in 2016 with the election of Donald Trump, when I realized that a book on lies and white supremacy might be timely. And so I made the probably foolish decision, and if there are any grad students in the room, do not do this. It is a terrible idea to try to write your first book not be your dissertation. Use the dissertation. One day I will go back to the dissertation, I'm sure. But it ultimately did lead, this and a few other steps led to a book entirely on this. But today I want to talk specifically about Julian Carr. And Julian Carr, the former namesake of this building, because he plays a central role in the book throughout the first 2 chapters, really, and a bit in the 5th chapter. But he was born in 1845. He attended UNC, go Heels, during the Civil War. Sorry, I got to throw that in at a Duke talk. How's your basketball team doing? Better than ours, actually. I should shut up. Might not want to go there. I know you guys had a loss recently, but we've had a few more. He would become a major capitalist with investments in tobacco, textiles, banking, variety of other industries. He was reputed to be the wealthiest man in North Carolina, and was one of the wealthiest for sure, there's no question. And he not only made a lot of money, he gave a lot of money away. Carr's gift of $10,000 to Duke in 1887 was the largest gift the college had ever received at the time. In 1890, Carr offered the land that became the present-day East Campus. That's where we're standing, right? This is East Campus? I don't know Duke's campus. So you wouldn't be here in some ways if it weren't for Carr. Of course, this very building was named for him. Now, to be clear, he did not ask for this building to be named for him. It was built after he was dead. And so there is not a donor intent issue for those of you who do issues of philanthropy. There's no donor intent question here that you had to deal with, say, at Vanderbilt with their Confederate Memorial Hall, which is a little different. But he gave a lot of money away. He gave money to churches, schools, veterans. They all benefited. And he loved to donate to monuments. But before we get into his money, let's talk a little bit about his earlier life. He also served in the Confederate Army. And this led him to become the leading Confederate veteran in North Carolina. He was one of the leading ones across the country. In fact, he became the head of the United Confederate Veterans by the end of his life, which was the sort of governing organization of Confederate veterans. It's the sort of the big Confederate veterans organization. And so he really represented all of them. And he was elected to that point because of his views, not despite of them. And so, for instance, in 1922, when the Grant Memorial was dedicated on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., it's the one right in front of the Capitol, he spoke as a representative of Confederate veterans. And so his views are representative, which is one of the reasons I come back to him again and again. And he spoke at more dedications than perhaps anyone else in North Carolina. When you're looking at monument dedications, I think Carr probably takes the number of most. But I think we should discuss, and he didn't just, I should point out, Carr had a role in many monuments in Durham, including the Spanish-American War one in Maplewood Cemetery. Picture of it right here. He was the president of the association. He loved to build monuments when I say that. The Unity Monument at Bennett Place, we're going to talk about a little later. He also helped get many of the monuments in Raleigh built. And here you can see him spent the day in Raleigh unveiling the Worth Bagley Monument. So in 1907, when a monument to Worth Bagley, the only U.S. naval officer killed in the Spanish-American War, was dedicated at the Capitol. It's still there. One speaker declared, amid cheers and I mean, this is a quote, that only in the South today is to be found the pure vein of the grand old Anglo-Saxon race by which this government was founded, right? The fact that an African-American seaman died alongside Bagley, literally, same shell, was forgotten. And so they sort of used it, though. So monuments to Confederate soldiers were therefore really only the most prominent and common of a variety of markers erected during the early 20th century over the landscape meant to evoke white supremacy, just as the politics that Carr also pushed. Carr, in his efforts to shape the historical narrative, rewrote the past in an ahistorical manner. And so I want to just really quickly, and here is another picture of Julian Carr and a list of all the different roles he played. I want to just sort of give you guys an introduction real quick to the lost cause and what I mean by the lost cause. The lost cause, which is the focus of this book, was a narrative of history that developed after the Civil War, although parts of it predate the Civil War. And it's a narrative of history that not only was used to uphold white supremacy in the American South during the Jim Crow era, but it was also premised upon falsehoods. And that is sort of one of the central tenets of the book. And so we can sort of break the lost cause narrative down into a few key points that were pretty much unanimous. Not everything is when you look at historical memory shared by everyone, but anyone putting up a Confederate monument would have agreed on certain key points. The first would have been an argument that slavery was benevolent. Now let me be clear. Slavery was not benevolent. Slavery was a system of labor premised upon the extraction of that labor through violence and the threat of violence and torture and murder. It was atrocious. Chattel slavery is horrifying. But the narrative that slavery was benevolent allowed you to believe, if you were a white supremacist, or tell yourself if you were a white supremacist in the early 20th century, that the reason race relations were messed up was because African Americans had been given the vote, not because, racial violence and oppression. The second sort of tenet, again, that was false, was that slavery was not the cause of the war. Now let me be clear. Slavery was the cause of the Civil War. But by denying it, you allow there to be a victory. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later if we have time. Reconstruction is the third topic. A belief that Reconstruction disrupted idyllic race relations, because remember, slavery was supposedly good, and was a corrupt period of misrule. And again, Reconstruction had as much corruption as any other period. And in fact, African American legislators were probably less corrupt in many ways. And they showed a remarkable, African Americans of the time showed a remarkable openness to democratic ideas and really shaped the country in a way positively. The reason we have public education in this country is largely coming out of Reconstruction. The first, in South Carolina, for instance, the first proposal to have universal public education for any race, let alone all races, was in 1867, brought forward by Robert Smalls. So this is what Carr said, right? But it's not the truth. He also would say things like African Americans dominated the politics of the Reconstruction era. Not true. There were 2,000 African Americans, at least, that were elected to various offices, but they were always a minority. However, their constituencies, the constituency of African Americans was quite large, especially in South Carolina and a few other states. Now, the fourth and final sort of key thing was the Confederates fought really valiantly. This is a bit trickier. There's disagreement on this, and this is something that the book discusses more fully and is making an argument that military historians will not like and may take exception to. And the question is, how well did Confederates? Did they fight more valiantly? Did they fight more nobly? Were they more devoted to their cause than any other fighter since Thermopylae, which is what Carr loved to say? He loved to be as devoted as the Spartans. Why you want to be like the Spartans, I've never figured out. They all died. They lost. But Carr wanted to be them. And this was sort of the myth, right? That the Confederate soldier, despite their ability, had lost. But let's look at Carr's actual military record, which is a little bit sparse. And here's what we know. He had a deferment, of course. as a student for much of the early war. He was eligible to enlist as early as 1862 or 1863 if he wanted, but he didn't. He waited until mid-1864, despite later claims that he volunteered. If you look right here, you will notice a word that indicates something else occurred. He is in fact listed as a conscript. So he was forcibly entered into the military. By the time he went in, everyone was entering. It was mandatory conscription, so he may have volunteered so he could join the unity once, but he didn't have a choice anyways. But I don't think he actually did. It actually looks like he was conscripted. And then he spent the first 3.5 months of his Confederate service working for the enrolling office, helping to conscript others into the military. So his job was literally to help force others to fight who might not want to otherwise. Eventually, sometime in the fall or winter of 1864, most likely after October, he finally went to war. He joined the 3rd North Carolina Cavalry, we're told. There are no records from the 3rd North Carolina Cavalry, though. Carr may have served even less time, may have served just 6 months total with a combat unit, or he may have served less, because there is some later reports indicate he was made a messenger, and so we don't know whether that meant he was in combat or less in combat. I mean, messengers still would have presumably seen. He may have been at the Battle of Five Forks. Unfortunately, Confederate record-keeping falls apart in 1865, and there aren't any real records from his unit, so we don't know for sure. But there were some reports later that said he never even saw combat. Now, I think those reports may be less than fair to him, but Carr's service became a central tenet of his personality and his identity, despite having served far less than almost any other Confederate veteran you could find. He regularly cited his service and subsequent support of Confederate veterans as proof that he was a white supremacist. He based his because back then you wanted to be a white supremacist if you want to get elected. So we're going to look now at the 1900 Senate campaign, moving forward in his life. This was the first Senate primary in North Carolina history. And essentially what happened was all the candidates, and I'm missing one I know, for those of you who are really in, but these were the three ones that mattered. But all 4 of them were basically pushing to be seen as the biggest white supremacist. That was the goal. That's how you win the race in 1900. It was not an insult to be called a racist. It was a requirement for election. Democrats headlined their printed slates, so their actual ballots, with the motto, "For White Supremacy." It's pretty clear. White supremacy clubs, that was what they called, white supremacy clubs, sprung up around the state to mobilize voters. That year, General Carr, as he liked to call himself, remember he was a private, but he got the title general because he'd served as the leader of the United Confederate Veterans. He never claimed he was a general, to be clear. He just took the title from the United Confederate Veterans. And so he ran for Senate on the platform that the white man shall rule the land or die. So it's pretty clear what he felt. Everyone knew how he felt about race when they invited him to speak at Silent Sam's dedication, to be clear. This was not a sort of, oh, nobody expected him to say that. He said this similar things at every dedication speech you look at of his. This one's just more explicit and more personal. When you look at the UNC one, it's that he's explicit about what violence he did. He frequently cited the Klan as a good thing. He ran on the platform that he would disenfranchise African Americans and he would liberalize pension laws, both of which are discussed ad nauseum in the book. Carr and one of his opponents, Alfred Waddell, in the center, were not only both prominent white supremacists and leading Democrats, but they were also 2 of the most well-known Confederate boosters in the state. Both of them were heavily involved in monument creation. Now, neither Carr nor Waddell would win the nomination. Furnifold McClendall Simmons, which may be the greatest senator name of the 19th century senator name you'll find, won the thing because he'd been a key organizer of the white supremacy campaigns of the 1890s and went on to serve as a senator for the next 30 years. But when Carr was pushing his sort of stance, when Carr wanted to be elected, he said, he kept saying, I was a Confederate veteran, you can trust me to be white supremacist. Trust me, trust me, trust me. He even had letters, and I put the sources up here because I don't want to be accused of being unfair to him. The quote that was put forward, now Mr. Simmons, Furnifold Simmons, if you'll remember, had spent his time working on the white supremacist campaigns of the 1890s, right? That was his service that proved his white. What is Mr. Simmons' 1 year of service in a comfortable office in Raleigh during the campaigns of 1898 and 1900 to Jules Carr 3 years in the trenches in the dark days of 1862, 63, and 64. Never mind 65. Now, this was campaign literature. He did not produce it. His campaign did. We don't know if he signed off on it. But later accounts of Carr would also include this 3 years claim. And he definitely didn't make a major effort to correct it until he got called out. And he did, in fact, get called out, as you can see here, a letter from one of his opponents, basically saying Waddell was actually in the same unit, which is true. Waddell was, although not at the same time. Waddell had due to poor health, he was a sickly fellow, had gone home already. But he basically said he was, in fact, he never served in battle. Don't know if it's accurate. Again, this is campaign literature, but we do know that the claim of 3 years was definitely exaggerated. But this was his bona fides to get elected, right? So this was not disconnected. When we see, and if you can see down here, it says, for senator, the chieftain of white supremacy. That's Furnifold Simmons' pin, and down here you have Julian Carr's Senate pins, as they sort of would push. And so we all know the famous speech now from 1913, but his views were actually moderate, I should point out, if you're looking at the Democratic Party. Only if you're looking at the Democratic Party. And I think that's important for us to recognize when we say that. Because you'll see people say, well, he was a moderate of his time. And it's true, but there were also Republicans at the time who were advocating African Americans be allowed to vote. In fact, a biracial alliance had been reformed, I should say. It had formed during the Reconstruction era, and it reformed in the 1890s during the Fusion movement, and in fact took control of the state. And suddenly no Confederate monuments are getting put up. I don't know. Maybe it's connected. It's connected. Spoiler alert. But it's really only after the disenfranchisement of African Americans in 1900 that you suddenly start seeing monuments spring up around North Carolina, because now white supremacists have something to celebrate. And these were sort of the people to celebrate. Now, Carr's record, though, of course, is mixed at best. And so we want to look for a minute at what he said. And this is from 1898. He was trying to moderate his views. And I'll read some of this if you can't see it. But he was criticized at times for being too nice to African Americans. Because he would do business with African Americans. It's a great way to undercut the costs of white labor if you threaten to hire black labor. I mean, it's all about the money, right? People will like to point out Carr would invest in, black businesses. When you invest in something, you get money back. That's not philanthropy. That's a business decision. And he saw it as profitable. But even there, when he's giving this money, it was a form of exerting power in these business relationships, because he would say, I am a friend of the Negro in his place, but mind you, he must be in his place. This, all caps, right? This is the way he sees the world. People often think racism requires hatred, and there may have been hatred at times, but it doesn't require hatred. It requires beliefs about social order, right? To Carr, it's not about hate to him. That violence is about maintaining society. It's policing society. Is it lead to hateful acts? No question. But if you read people like Ibram Kendi, you start to see that racial views come out of policy and not the other way around, perhaps, is one way of looking at it. So he was very clear, and he would say things like down here, and while I enjoy the respect and confidence of African Americans, not one of them would, for his right arm, would presume to forget a Negro's place in my presence, right? He would be violent if necessary. So unlike Waddell, who was like, let's clog the river with bodies in a public speech in 1890, that's 1900, I think he gives that speech, and had led the 1898 Wilmington Race Massacre. Yeah, sure, he's moderate. But that's like pretty low bar. That's like he's more honest than the president. I don't know. It's not a high bar I'm setting there. But Carr's record is mixed at best, right? We do know he was a member of the Klan. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But let's go ahead and look at Carr as a philanthropist. Carr was widely known as a moderate, and African Americans would routinely compliment him. W.E.B. Du Bois would even compliment Carr at times, tell him a friend to Durham's African American population. And he would say things like, according to Du Bois, guys like Carr had taken a hands-off, give them a chance, don't interfere approach to African Americans. Carr did not oppose economic advancement for African Americans. He seemed to view it as good for business. He was a capitalist, first and foremost. He used African American labor. He gave loans, again, made himself a prophet. And he did give out money. But even in his giving out of money, there was an element of white supremacy playing a part in how and why and where he gave that money. As I mentioned, he had sort of, tried to inoculate himself from being viewed as too moderate. But in a capitalistic society, money is power. The defunding of African American education by conservative politicians that he funded, supported, gave large amounts of money to. In fact, he brags at one point that he gave $10,000. This is in 1900, midway through the campaign. I've already given $10,000 to white supremacy. That's the same amount he gave Duke. And that's in one campaign. So he basically funded newspapers that were white supremacist newspapers that would push propaganda, often race-baiting propaganda leading to lynchings, and to defunding of African American education, right? The election of his party and the people he supported. And so black educators were dependent upon men like Carr for donations, or they would fall apart. And one of the things that meant is that he could control curriculum, right? That's why he would give to trade schools and not liberal arts colleges, because that's where he felt society should be structured. Again, racism about societal structure. But this also meant that African American educators had to give him something, including letting him speak at graduation ceremonies. So let's see what he'd say. This is a speech he gave at Biddle University's graduation. This was to an audience of African Americans, I want to be clear. And he would still push the lost cause narrative. This is what he bought, if you will. If he was being honest on the debate stage, he'd say he bought it. He bought the chance to give this talk. And he talked about how good slavery was for enslaved people to a black audience. He talked about how it civilized barbarians, how Reconstruction had been bad for blacks. And the title of the speech was Before the War, right? It's literally making fun of African American speech in the title of his speech to an African American audience. Can you imagine sitting through this speech at your graduation? You thought it was bad when you graduated from college or high school and had to listen to how you're going to change the world, the same speech everyone gives. At least you didn't have this, is all I'm saying. He told of how paternalistic Southern white men would always look after their friends as long as they behaved. And then he said that African Americans needed to stop appealing to Northerners on the grounds of ill treatment by Southern whites. Stop asking Northerners for money because we don't treat you well. That's a lie. We treat you well. The implication was obvious, though. Don't complain nationally about race relations, or you will be harmed, or at the very least lose these funding that we're giving you, right? It was contingent. And no one in the room, everyone in the room knew he was lying about slavery. Everyone knew he was lying about what caused problems between races and what the situation on the ground was like. But no one could object. Administrators risked their funding if they stood up and said, wait a minute, you can't say that. This was a threat disguised as a history lesson. History had been weaponized. Carr was telling, perhaps Du Bois is telling the 10th to stay in line, stop complaining. Don't go to Northerners to get funds. Despite his seeming kindness, through donations and vocal assertions that he was their friend, Carr was a devoted white supremacist. The very donation he gave while he gave donations to black schools, he gave far more to trying to keep black schools from being funded by the state. And he was a leading donor, right? In the 1880s, he funded Randolph Shotwell, who'd been pardoned by President Grant after he had led the North Carolina Ku Klux Klan. He gave him a newspaper for free. Just was like, here, have a newspaper. Go do white supremacy stuff. Josephus Daniel, the purchase of the News and Observer. Carr's backing. He never got money back on it. And I mentioned earlier, he bragged about how much money he'd given before. And I want to look at another thing where Carr gets his money. This is another sort of fun one, if you will. This was to the A&M College at Greensboro. He gave an address in which he defended lynching to an African-American audience. And no one could speak up. In it, he said that the question of the future of the Southern Negro is one that must be deferred for settlement until we have restored the safety and feeling of the security in the humblest woman in the poorest cabin in the remotest corner of the most thinly settled portion of the South. Black lives matter less than white women feeling comfortable. That was literally the message he told a black audience. And he could do that because of the money he gave. And no one could complain. By lying to their face, he was showing everyone who was in power. It was an exertion of power. Masha Gaston has sort of looked at this, at how politicians in the 21st century do this. But the same can be applied to political figures far earlier. Now, Carr also was not opposed to violence. And I want to quickly point this out. Before we get to the Union announcement, we not only have the assault in 1930, he announced he was a member of the Klan in 1921, and he would announce he was a member of the Second Klan in 1923 during a veterans reunion. He would announce he was a member of the Second Klan. So he was a devout, open member. Now, I want to quickly, if we have time, yeah, we got a few more minutes, before I wrap up, look at some of the monuments that he looked at. And this is the Unity Monument at Bennett Place, in which Carr had his first break with the UDC. Carr had two major breaks with the United Daughters of the Confederacy, the people who put up a lot of the monuments around here. And the first was with the Unity Monument at Bennett Place. The local chapter of the UDC, named after Julian Carr, objected to it because they thought it was a surrender monument, which it is. Carr realized that he could rewrite surrender into a moment of unity. And so he says, this monument, he said, was where the terms of peace were decided. It's very different than surrender. It was not the terms of peace, it was a surrender. It calls remembrance of the events when North and South threw down their swords, clasped hands, and pledged themselves to unity. That is not what happened. One side put down their swords. The other side kept their swords. Right? Now, Carr did not go as far as some, I should point out. W.D. Turner, when at the dedication of the Statesville Monument, rejected the term lost cause. He's like, it wasn't a lost cause, guys. There was no surrender on the 9th of April, 1865 at Appomattox, but a compromise. A statement that would have surprised, of course, Grant and Lee, who had actually been there. Carr would admit that there was a surrender, but he pulled a victory from defeat, and here he is. You can actually see him speaking right there in the red circle at the dedication in his Confederate uniform. And here's another picture of the dedication. But he would actually say, we lost, but we won. That was his sort of whole shtick. And how did he justify this? How did he make this argument? Well, the principle for which the proud people waged the war was triumphant, he said. Again, he had to erase the cause of the war, slavery, because slavery is erased. Right? To Carr, the principle was states' rights, a critical element in resisting federal intrusions. Now, he knew that wasn't true. In other speeches, he would admit that slavery was the cause of the war. Usually when talking to black audiences, as a way of actually sort of proving his point that African Americans had really been loyal. He's like, even when there was a war to free you, you stayed loyal, about how loyal they were. Sorry, terrible grammar there. But he would have used terrible grammar in those speeches frequently, in fairness. But it was a critical element of resisting federal intervention, right? States' rights has long been a white supremacist battle cry. And so you erase the 14th and 15th Amendment, the sort of key ones in ensuring rights, and just accept the 13th. as the outcome of the war in their rewriting. Now that's pretty standard rewriting for him. Now I want to look at one more monument before we finish up, because I think this one's really funny. And this is one where the Julian Carr and the Julian Carr chapter, again, butted heads. And this is pretty ironic. Carr felt the Durham Monument should be more expensive. He thought nothing less than $15,000 would do, which is, when you think about it, $15,000 is massively expensive. That's twice the cost of Silent Sam. That's nearing the cost of the Raleigh monument if you're sort of looking at costs. This would be a very expensive monument. That is not what the monument that got put up costs. We'll talk about what happens to it later. The original plan was to raise $5,000, and it led Carr to withdraw from the effort. He's like, I won't be involved. And this feud develops between the two. So it's sort of going on at the same time as this feud over the Unity Monument, right? And Carr died shortly before the dedication of the Carr Monument. And it was quite cheap. It was quite cheap, which is why when it was pulled down, it crumpled. Because it was literally, we're talking in the hundreds rather than the thousands that it probably cost. I would guess. I haven't actually checked the exact price, but it was definitely less than the $5,000 to which he had objected in the first place. So this is where it gets really funny. Because Carr had objected to this monument, but at the dedication, there was a tribute to Carr who'd recently died. One speaker asserted that Carr was there in spirit, and the master rewriter of history himself, Carr, could not escape his own story being rewritten by others. And they said that he would have loved the monument during the dedication, that he's there in spirit and he would be so happy about this monument going up, and just totally erased a multi-year feud that had occurred. So what would he think of the pulling down of the Durham Monument? How would he have viewed it? I think he probably would have been unhappy it was put up, but once it was up, he would have been horrified to see it pulled down. One thing is sure, he would be horrified to see Duke and UNC both accepting non-white students, I suspect. But also, we don't have to care what he wanted. So only what we want. And with that, I'll take questions.
Talk about John O'Daniel.
Who? John O'Daniel?
The half-brother.
Oh, the half-brother, yes. Julian Carr is not uncommon in families like his, who were slave-owning families, had a half-brother who was fathered by his father and an African-American woman. He did have, there's not a lot of data on it. We have some oral histories that talk about it, but Carr did make a point of, as was common, providing for that part of the family. Never that they would necessarily be wealthy, but making sure that they had jobs, and that was a not surprising thing. But throughout the South, during the era of slavery, rape was common. It was a commonly understood thing. And when we talk about the horrors of slavery, we're not just talking about whipping for labor. And we often think it's about labor, but there's also sexual exploitation. Women are being advertised openly in Southern newspapers as sex slaves. Women as young as 12 years old are being advertised openly as sex slaves in the New Orleans paper of record. So it's hardly surprising. And frequently these women were then later sold themselves if they had children, right? The children of this unholy act would be done. So does that answer the question? I mean, again, there's very little we know because, of course, it was all hush-hush, and nobody's writing that down.
My name is Darrell. Really interesting presentation here. I started a church in downtown Durham about 6 months ago. We meet at the Hayti Center.
Yes.
And so literally his name is written on the stained glass window.
Yes.
This is a very diverse church, very young adults, college. And so it's really just fascinating, like seeing his name, but also now hearing his history. So thank you for that. Thank you for your research.
Well, and let me just say about that the interesting thing is he would give money to black churches,
sure,
right? And because he saw religion, not surprisingly, as a way of teaching certain morals, right? I mean, Christianity had long been used to uphold slavery. So it's no surprise that he would give money to churches, and he loved to see his name, he loved to be recognized. I mean, I think there's an ego element of he loved the idea of a bunch of African Americans who are like thanking him, right? It sort of harkened back on some level, on a psychological level. That being said, it's a beautiful stained glass window, I understand. I haven't actually been over there myself yet. I need to get over there.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is sort of the problem when you deal with these issues of philanthropy that are problematic, is that they also did provide the literal bricks to build black institutions. So what do you do? But you have another question following.
Yeah. But I love that point. I mean, that would be a really neat rabbit hole to trace.
Oh, there's tons to go there.
That funding streams to actually segregationist theologies that were constructed. But anyways, yes. My question is, like, I saw one of your archival pieces. Like, he said that we lost, but we won.
Right. We lost, but we won.
Right. And as a Southerner, I lived in Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas. The landscape is littered with Confederate iconography. Is he right? I mean, did they win? Because you have an entire generations of people that have grown up with this lost cause ideology, and that again, we're still seeing battles today over even the thought of removing some of these pieces. Mitchell Landrieu wrote a great book, In the Shadow of...
right, Mitchell Landrieu's work is
great. In the Shadow of Statues,
right.
In New Orleans. So I'm just curious, the question, did they win?
So this is a great question.
How
do you judge it? There's a great book coming out in April that I'm very excited to see come out. Buy it after you've read mine, please. This is the second best book on the topic, obviously. But it's coming out by Heather Cox Richardson, which is called How the South Won the Civil War. And so there's some people who would say that the South, and I would actually say the Confederacy. I don't like using the term South when we're talking about Confederates, because I think the South, we should always remember, includes African Americans, right? And there's a great line by Vernon Burton, who's a historian of the American Civil War, who likes to point out when he's in South Carolina that South Carolinians didn't lose the Civil War. South Carolinians won the Civil War because the vast majority of South Carolinians supported the Union, because the vast majority of South Carolinians were enslaved, right? And so when you start sort of, you can sort of change the sort of way of thinking about it. So the question isn't so much did the South win, right? But did white Southerners win? And I guess the answer is they didn't win the Civil War, but perhaps they defeated Reconstruction. I mean, basically what you have some historians of military history, if you start looking at military history, who argue that the Klan and other groups like the White Liners and Red Shirts, which are the sort of groups that follow the Klan after the Klan's suppressed, were successful insurgents. And you can use insurgent theory to understand them actually quite well. If you're looking in Mississippi at the White Liner movement, there's some really compelling arguments that this is a successful insurgency that follows all the rules of an insurgency. And a terrorist campaign. And so in that way, they are successful, but then at the same time, is it over would be the question, right? You have the long civil rights movement scholars who are like, African Americans don't stop fighting, right, for their freedoms. I mean, you think of like 1876, Reconstruction ends. African Americans are serving in Congress until 1901, right? North Carolina is sending a black congressman until 1901. Only after disenfranchisement does the last African American until the Voting Rights Act is passed, would you have another African American in Congress? But, it's not immediate, right? This is an ongoing conflict. So I think maybe the best way to think about it is that when you look at the Civil War as a fight over sort of how race relations work, it never ends. And the same ideologies never die. And one of the things the book pays a lot of attention to is how racial ideologies evolve and how the history that backs them up, what I would call historical racism, sort of as a sort of side to historical scientific racism, right? Where you use science to justify racism. There's historical racism where you use historical narratives to justify racism. Same sort of principle applies, that you can see how those evolve. And so both the racial ideologies evolve, and that's what like Ibram Kendi spends so much time about. And what I'm really interested in, how do the historical narratives that uphold those racial ideologies also evolve? Because I think it's fundamental to identity to understand the historical narrative of how we supposedly got here. So hopefully that answers.
How the Confederates won? What was that book?
How the South Won the Civil War by Heather Cox Richardson. It comes out in April, I think, if I'm not mistaken. It should be excellent. If you're not already following her on her daily newsletter, you need to get on it. It's phenomenal. She gives a daily, almost daily newsletter or Facebook update you can sign up for, giving you basically a briefing of what happened in the news so you don't have to read it, and with the historians perspective, and she's brilliant. She's one of the best Reconstruction historians in the country, and a wonderful person as well. And so I'm very excited for that book. Yeah.
So thank you so much. And as a former resident in my previous job of the other Carr building that still is over at the other university, the one in Chapel Hill, and also I live outside of Carrboro.
I spent 6 years living in Carrboro.
Yes. What can you tell us about other things that are named for him? You know, what his involvement was? What was the university thinking in 1900 when it named the Carr building over there?
Yeah. So the Carr building was named in what year again? Do you remember?
That building was built about 1900.
Yeah, so like in that point, I think Carr actually helped fund that one. And Carr was a member of the board of trustees and was sort of a prominent donor already to UNC. So I think that one actually, I haven't looked at it carefully, to be honest. I haven't looked at that one. I've looked at, Saunders Hall, which is no longer Saunders Hall. Carrboro, Carr Mills. I mean, there's a ton of stuff named after him. A lot of his industries, the buildings are still named after him, right? There was a Carr building at the public schools, I think you mentioned in the introduction, that was renamed. I don't know of any others off the top of my head, but even anything named after Carrboro, of course, also has a tie. So Carrboro High School, right? You could start sort of thinking about. A friend of mine once pointed out, though, there's an amazing irony that Carrboro is Carrboro, right? And that, like, maybe the best revenge is that it has to bear the name Carrboro, like, so that, like both as a revenge against the hipsters, but also, like, God Carr must be rolling over in his grave to know that Weaver Street is Weaver Street, and that this is the precincts in North Carolina that were most opposed to, like, HB2 are Carrboro, literally. And yeah, I mean, so, like, he would have absolutely hated that Carrboro is named Carrboro. So, I mean, maybe the best, I don't know. I don't really have an answer, but I think there is a great irony there. There's an irony which, of course, as hipsters, all the hipsters that live there must appreciate, because hipsters must appreciate irony. It's a law.
Yes, there was an educator here, William Gaston Pearson, W.G. Pearson. Mm-hmm. It's my understanding that Carr paid for his education at Shaw University.
Yeah.
Did you come across any more comprehensive relationship between the two of them?
I didn't run into anything on them specifically, but there are multiple cases where Carr does fund individuals who are non-white and their education. He actually funds a guy from China. He funds the education of him and becomes friends with. Pretty sure the guy was from China.
Yeah, Charles Soong.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, I'm pretty sure that's where he was from. And they have like a long-standing letter back and forth. And he actually goes to China at one point. He actually gives a speech out in the Philippines, in Manila, in which he talks about how Reconstruction was terrible. So he's selling his lost cause on his like international trip. So it's not just domestic when you're talking about like how he's sort of using philanthropy. It's international how he's using his philanthropy. But no, it's not uncommon. I didn't look that carefully into that one specifically, unfortunately. His financial records are all over the place.
So my question is, how do you think Duke students should kind of incorporate this information into our lives, and kind of how should we contextualize and understand the name change despite the fact that the legacies of racism and Carr's influence still prevail on the day-to-day?
It's a really important question. What should Duke students do? I'm going to be honest with you. I don't know that I'm the person to ask. I think you guys are the person to ask of what we should do. And I've noticed, I've talked to a lot of people about sort of studying college history, and specifically African-American history lately. I've gotten really into this. I'm doing some research now on the College of Charleston's own history and its ties to slavery, which are, oh my goodness. It's deeper, and it's deeper than any of you realize is the crazy part, right? I mean, it's like I'm finding stuff that nobody realized as I dive into this stuff. But what I've noticed is that when students lead initiatives, things happen. UVA has one of the most robust efforts to try to educate. They're building a memorial. And the reason is students demanded it. So I think whatever the answer is, you need to demand it of your administration. And I hope no administrators are here to hear me say that, because I'll never get invited back. But I think it's really important, and I think students in many schools, and a place like Duke especially, students' demands carry in some ways more weight than professors' demands. And so when students demand something, it makes a huge difference. So whatever the answer is, I think students should take leadership. And I think faculty will provide you guidance when you need it. And you should go to them for guidance. They're great people. And you have great faculty in the history department here. I mean, I know a lot of them. Again, I went to UNC. We're just down the road. I had reading groups over here. And I know a lot of the Duke professors here. They're an amazing group. And they'd be happy to help you, I'm sure. But ultimately, it's not for me to say what should be done. It's for communities to say. And I think that's like my takeaway message has always been when I'm asked by reporters, and they ask me this all the time, what should we do about monuments? I don't know. Let the community decide. And that's what we don't have right now, is we don't let communities decide. That's what heritage laws are about. They're anti-democratic inherently, right? They're designed to keep you from being able to change it. That's really the goal of them.
So William Boyd Duke, historian, wrote that Trinity College would not have survived without Carr guaranteeing the loans. It was facing bankruptcy in Randolph County. Carr, so there would be no Duke University today if it were not for Carr.
Yeah, no question.
And he's the only person to have a building named after him at both UNC and Duke.
Well, not anymore, but you used to. Yeah, I mean, it is a tricky issue, right? These are tricky issues, and ultimately communities have to decide who should represent them. And I think that's the takeaway is that. No. Yeah, no, it is a ties to Duke. I mean, can you really expect a college though in Randolph County to survive? I mean, I got to pick on Randolph County, right? Actually, I should point out Randolph County during the Civil War, hotbed of unionism and dissent during the Civil War. Massive numbers of deserters. Great book by William Almond on that topic, and also a book by Vicky Bynum on the topic as well. So.
Hi, my name is Paz. I'm a student of Professor McLean's. Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
So my question is, I definitely agree, with everything you have to say, and my question is, where do you draw the line between someone in history that should stay or should go? Because I feel like there's other, characters within U.S. history that have also actively been racist. Thomas Jefferson had so many slaves.
Right.
And where do you break even on the balance between their contributions to U.S. history and their personal preferences or actions? Because I guess,
it's a really important question, and I think it's a question that a lot of people struggle with. And the first thing I need to say is I want to draw a distinction between Confederates like Robert E. Lee and Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson is remembered despite his racial views. Robert E. Lee is remembered because of his racial views. So I think that's the first important distinction to draw. The second important distinction to draw, I would say, is I think, again, it's up to the communities to decide. I don't think that this is the historian's job necessarily to tell us, because this isn't a question of history being erased. It's a question of what's being celebrated, right? There's a difference between history, which is a reasonable reconstruction of the past and the critical analysis that historians do in your history class and that you're learning to do this semester. I'm positive, knowing whose class you're in, that you're learning how to do critical analysis of historical sources, right? You're learning this sort of skill set. That's history. You're learning about the past, and you're learning to analyze it. Memory is things we celebrate and how we create identity, and it's based not on the truth, on any sort of sense of truth or the past, but on the needs of the present. And so what I look at explicitly in my book, in fact, is that a lot of historians sort of look at historical memory as what's forgotten, what's remembered. And I'm adding a third element to that. You got what's forgotten, what's remembered. And what's forgotten is just as important as what's remembered, right? We erase the cause of the war. But it's not just what's forgotten, it's what's fabricated. That third element that's been largely ignored in memory studies is not just how we create a narrative out of select, and we all do this ourselves when we think about how we tell a story after a drunken night. At a frat party, right? You break your foot. Well, I had a student who had this happen to them. They came into school with a broken arm, and it's like, well, how'd you explain it to your parents? And they're like, I tripped on bricks. Right? I'm like, yeah, in 20 years, you're going to still be telling the story that you broke your arm when you tripped on bricks to your parents because you're not going to admit you were drunk when underage. and probably everyone knows the lies there, again. But the point is that you have this third element, right? And that historians, when we sort of think about how we connect the dots to create a narrative strand, it's always about, it's really always about what's those three elements. And so we're looking at those, and which three we celebrate, which aspects we celebrate is the question we have to ask. So it's a great question. I don't have a good answer for you. I'm sorry. You got to decide. Who's next?
All right, so thank you. I mean, this research is just so incredibly important and I guess not surprising, but a revelation and so powerful in the detail. And it's exciting as a faculty member in this institution to see the willingness to come to terms with this history and remove that name. So the memory correction that's going on is really important. As a faculty member here, I also find myself so disheartened that, and you probably are experiencing this with UNC, that universities that are facing the history of their involvement in promoting this neo-Confederate fake history are accepting money from the Charles Koch Foundation. Both of our universities are. They have a joint project, and it's really depressing in this university, which raised $2 billion, right? They don't need Charles Koch's money, and yet we've taken it. And Charles Koch, for those of you who don't know the history of the Koch network, announced their presence in the state by undermining a successful desegregation program in Wake County, setting off a huge civil disobedience campaign to try to fight that and protect that program. They went on to flood the state with money to elect legislators who were doing voter suppression, the most extreme gerrymander we've ever seen, who used bigotry to get people to the polls. Charles Koch Foundation is involved with funding people who do neo-Confederacy. There's a constant peel-off between the libertarian cause and neo-Confederacy and white supremacy. And yet we're taking that money, right? We have that money here. And I just do not see how the same administrators who are willing to acknowledge the history of Julian Carr will turn a blind eye to taking that tainted money now. Also, I don't see how any university in the world can take Koch money when Charles Koch Foundation alone is the top funder of climate science denial. They've spent, by Greenpeace calculations, over $127 million promoting climate science denial, more than ExxonMobil, and yet it's the same dynamic, right? The universities will do anything for money, and what we are doing with the Charles Koch Foundation is money laundering, plain and simple. And another generation will look back on this and say, how in God's name did a university accept that tainted money? Look what's happening to our climate. Look what's happened to race relations. Look what's happened to our democracy. Have you followed this at UNC?
Wow.
Sorry, it's my personal.
I understand. No, I mean, I know that. I mean, I have followed it I have not followed it at UNC because I've been out at the College of Charleston. But I am familiar with it occurring. Pretty much every institution is having this sort of.
300.
I mean, maybe a lot of schools. I know that there's Koch money being taken by a lot of schools, and that it remains controversial by faculty. I know faculty members who object to it down in Charleston as well. And so I think this is a case again where you have people putting forward two arguments here of. Which is not dissimilar to earlier times of, okay, well, we take the money because otherwise it's going to be used on democratic politics in the 1890s. Otherwise it's going to be used on white supremacy campaigns. Now you'll hear similar people make similar arguments today. And I'm not defending these arguments, but I think there are maybe parallels, right? I think you do.
They're also recruiting students into this
right.
enterprise.
Well, and then that is the issue, right? Is that these are sort of there's definitely ideological elements of them, and there's issues of academic freedom of who's allowed, of sort of what people are allowed to say, and so yeah, it does create in a similar way. You do have issues of academic freedom. There's no question that have been raised at certain institutions about who can come speak and stuff, and there have been some successful cases where money was returned because there were demands that they would get to have a say in how the money was spent that went too far. So I think that there probably is some similarities you can draw. I haven't thought about them yet, so I don't want to go too deep that's heavy. It's heavy stuff.
I learned a lot. I knew a little bit of the story, but it's really interesting to get the more granular details. But what I wanted to ask, and I'm really, I think, coming at the sort of this kinds of issues that Nancy raised, perhaps I may not come at it as eloquently. In many ways, this is not a surprising story, right? The details may vary, but I would say this is the story of philanthropists, many places, and not just in the U.S., right? I was thinking of roads, one of the biggest examples where we have seen this, right? Or I'm thinking very recently in the U.S. context of Sackler and the money being returned.
Oh, yeah.
But not always and everywhere under a lot of pressure.
Well, and there's changes, too. Right? There are some changes in the sense that donor intent matters more than it used to.
Yes, well, that's because of the law. Yes, it's a huge
issue in U.S. law.
Right. Yeah, and Nancy raised the question of money laundering, but there is what I might even call memory laundering.
Yes.
Right? All philanthropy works, I would argue, through rewriting history. It has to work. I would say it would, one could make the argument for almost every philanthropic case. And I say this because, as I was mentioning before,
you're doing study on
I'm
this.
working on global philanthropy, right? So, but the question I have is perhaps a conceptual one, but I hope you take it as an ethical question.
Yeah, okay.
Instead of the binary of the true and the false, there is the tradition of the noble lie. Right? And how would then we defend, how would we as historians push back against the argument of the noble lie, which is that, a lot of this kind of what we would as historians call falsehood is a noble lie in the sense that regardless of what the donor did, the effect today is it's one could argue Duke is educated. Hundreds of thousands of students have gone on to do good in the world.
Richard Nixon and... Richard Spencer. I'm sorry.
Do you know what I mean, right? This would be, people would say, well, what are you then saying all private philanthropy has to stop? I mean...
No, I'm not.
Yes. Well, why not? I would argue.
I mean...
So, this is the dilemma that we all get into, right? So I wondered if you could speak to that.
Man, you guys are giving good questions and hard questions. Oh, thank you. I am a UNC fan, so I had to call those out. No, this is a really important question, and I joke about some of the graduates, but no, this is a really important question of how do we deal with this fact that there's almost always tainted money too. I mean, like someone who was upset with a comment I made once pointed out that the Addlestone Library at the College of Charleston was from a family that was involved in mining. And that's where the money came from. I know nothing about the Addlestones at all, so I could be totally wrong, but this is what the guy told me.
Duke and tobacco.
Right, Duke and tobacco. I mean, Carr and tobacco as well. And where do you think Carr's getting his money? Carr's getting his money in exploitive labor practices. I mean, it's always going to be, is this a condemnation of capitalism? Is the next question, right? I mean, and I'm hesitant to do that because I'm going to get labeled a Marxist. And, that's not really how I approach history. I'm not a Marxist historian, at least. But no, it's a really, I think this is sort of the questions that we need to be asking about how we approach education as well. And is Duke really doing good work always? I would add the question of, Duke is giving people education, but who has access to that education? Which people have access and which can afford it? And, there's a school, I'm not going to name names, but that likes to brag that 50% of their students have financial aid. And it's like, wow, that's great. They're giving financial aid to 50% of their students. Well, what does that mean? It means 50% of the students can afford to pay $70,000 to go to that school. So it's like, all right, that's good. But who are you really educating in that situation? You have a small number that are almost there to change the educational experience of the wealthy, right? And so what are the ethical dilemmas we have as professors, right? Teaching at an institution that perhaps perpetuates class and racial divisions to this day. And you have additional things of sort of who has access. I saw a talk, I'm trying to remember who was giving it. Someone was giving this talk about sort of looking at who's going to African Americans in education today, right? Who's getting into college, and they basically found that at elite schools, a lot of the African American students are going to be second generation students, and so that like first generation students aren't really having access, and so there's this sort of, if you start breaking it down more carefully, some group really don't have access at all, and when you start thinking about that, it like changes things again, right? So you have this sort of intersectionality of class and race and gender all coming together. And it can be daunting, and I think that the only thing we can do is try to fix where we see problems. I don't think we can. The system's always going to have inherent racism in it because it was built on it. The question is, how do you fix it? Well, there's two options. You tear it down and burn it and start from scratch, which I don't know that maybe that'll work, but I don't know that it's practical, and I'm not sure I'm ready to give up my job security to try that attempt. But the other option is do what you can, right? And that may be the more realistic option, because revolution's really violent and bloody and usually ends in something worse than you started with. And so I think the answer is you keep trying to do better. And how you do better, you gotta, I don't know, always. Yeah.
So this is more of a comment than a question. So I don't know what other money Duke gets from the Koch Foundation, but I know what's come into the law school, at least one part of what's come into the law school. And I think this is a at least moderate good news story. There's absolutely no control of the content. It's for criminal justice research. We all know we have a big problem with mass incarceration, lots of very negative problems within the criminal justice system. And there's no control of the content. The people who are working on this really want to improve the system for everyone. And Koch has actually been in the criminal justice space for a long time, it's in a very progressive fashion. Now,
it's very troubling to many groups who are on the ground, I can tell.
Well, be that as it may, I know what research we're doing, right? And I know that there is no control. And I know that students are being involved in the research, that they're being trained. And so, I mean, you can debate what the source of that money was. I actually don't know how the Kochs made all their money, but it's over in a foundation now. And I think that it is actually accomplishing both valid educational objectives, and I think it has the potential to really generate very positive policy consequences. It is nothing like denying climate change.
Well, that's what you see with Carr as well. I mean, I think you actually do see some interesting parallels, right? Is that Carr is giving money to causes that we would support today and causes we wouldn't support today, right? Just as he's giving money to Duke, he's also giving money to North Carolina A&M, right? Which is great, and he's giving money to, but he's also giving money to white supremacist politicians who are running on the platform that we should murder people, like literally. They're giving speeches like, and he's donating money to them. So like it's always, this is sort of the question, right? Of that, is the specific donation the issue or is the donor the issue? And I don't have an answer for you on that. I'm not going to try to answer, but this is like a classic case with the Koch brothers, right? Is that they on a few specific issues are not what we would call to the right, right? And necessarily, depending on how you define the right, I don't want to get too in the weeds, right? But like criminal justice reform is sort of one of their areas where they do break frequently from the Republican Party. And so I don't have an answer though. And it's messy. And I think that these are questions that I think the important thing, we have the conversation is the starting point. And I don't have the answer. And that's why you need interdisciplinary work. You have to have philosophers and legal scholars and anthropologists and sociologists all talking together about sort of what are the meanings of this and what is this implication, because there's a sociological impact. There's an anthropological impact, right, of all this. It's not just historical and it's not just legal. And so I think this is where interdisciplinary studies is really important.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Miles Carr, Julian Carr's great nephew.
Well, welcome.
So thank you, Adam, for your work. And I would like to say on behalf of the Carr family, and representing the family, we celebrate Duke's decision to remove the name from the building. And and I celebrate your work. So I think when we ask a lot of these questions as far as, where do we go, how do we move forward, I think the answer is understanding the truth, presenting the facts, and then celebrating, changing how we celebrate. So the removal of that name is welcomed and is how it should be. But there needs to also be that emphasis on delivering the truth, because without, looking at the historical evidence, we all know that none of us, in a way, are sitting in this room having this talk if not for what happens, right? So I think
we are a product of history.
So it's I think what you're doing in your work is exactly where we need to move as a society, in the direction of understanding our history, changing the way we celebrate our history so that we can shape our future.
Have you considered a career in public history? Because I think this is what you're pointing out, is that this is not just a historical question, this is a public history question. And we had an earlier question from a student, I think they may have left already, unfortunately, about what do we do, right, as students and faculty to deal with this. And part of the answer is public history, and I think it's a really important thing that not all departments have embraced yet. And it's very tricky when you start dealing with tenure, of sort of like how you measure issues of public history. But public history, and it's something that I work heavily in, and I have a firm belief that it's important. I'm writing something right now with a park ranger. We're co-authoring a thing on how to deal with surrender at national parks, which is a totally different topic, I know. But this question of like, do we put up a sign in front of the Carr building and talk about it? Like maybe that's part of the answer, is you put up a sign and say, this is Duke's legacy, and you make sure it's on the tours. You have down at University of Alabama, Hillary Green is doing tours about the history of slavery on campus, and has thousands of people coming on them now. And universities, though, need to support this. And she's not getting support from her school. She's doing this on her own time. She doesn't get tenure credit for this. But, she'll be okay because she's a brilliant scholar. But, it is a complicated thing. But I think this is an appeal to public history as well. And I thank you for coming and telling me that. And I thank you for owning, right, the fact that we are a product of our history. I think that if we learn nothing else from history, it's that we are a product of both the good and the bad, right? I mean, if I look at my own family history, I can find nasty stuff. I have. I love to call my dad and tell him about it because he squirms. And it's fun to see your dad squirm. But no, I think I thank you for bringing that, and I think it's a great way to end the evening, is to recognize that the legacy of all individuals is complex. And Carr not only gave us these problematic legacies, he also gave us you. So.
Which is really just a comment. He actually attends my church, and so one of the reasons why he wanted to start coming was he wanted to kind of rewrite the story of his family, and the fact that he's now sitting under the teaching of a black man, and we're serving together for the good of Durham. It's just really.
I mean, this is something that I know Carr would not have loved. But I think that's okay, because I think our goal is not to be what our ancestors wanted us to be. Our goal should be better than them, and that's what I aim for.
To that point, it's funny, when we worship on Sundays, almost every Sunday, I laugh and grin in my spirit, and I think if Julian were to look down, I'm sitting in a church that was historically a black church.
That he helped fund.
Our main pastor is black, and then I love our congregation. Most of our congregation is actually, a lot of our kids are, mixed, and it's beautiful, and I laugh, and there, as I stand at the back of the worship, serving, I stand right in front of the window that bears his name.
Yeah.
How ironic is that, as we move forward and use our history to change our future for that.
Thank you very much.